To Okay, so welcome. I think we have some new folks joining us today. So, given that, I'm just going to give you a quick synopsis of who we are and what we're about in this space. So, first, my name is Eileen Schumann. I am the Associate for Global Engagement and Resources with the Presbyterian Hunger Program. And we have created this Global Solidarity Collective, which is an initiative of the Hunger Program that is meant to unite U.S. Presbyterians and global partners to do that challenging work of decolonizing, no less than decolonizing the economy, working to resist exploitative systems, supporting Indigenous rights, and promoting just, sustainable ways of living in harmony with all of creation. And this space specifically is primarily geared towards U.S. Presbyterians. It's a space where we come together to learn, support one another, and take action to undo the harms of the doctrine of discovery, while at the same time embracing Indigenous wisdom and advocating for just policies that protect people and the planet. And we have another space called Centering Partners' Voices, which is a more global space where we bring in partners from all over the world that help us learn about the issues that they're addressing in their particular contexts. So, with that said, I will hand over the floor to my colleague Jed Coble.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jed Coble. I am the Global Ecumenical Liaison for South America. For those of you who know me in the past, that's my new title. But I'm still here in Lima, Peru, and so happy to be with you today. Before we introduce our very special guest, Madison, let us first open with a word of prayer. Let us pray. God of life and liberty, we gather today in reverence in the midst of seemingly unending unrest in this world, in the midst of struggles for freedom, struggles for dignity, struggles for basic human decency, from the streets of Los Angeles to the shores of Gaza, from war-torn lands of Sudan and Congo to the hungry poor of Yemen and beyond, and back again to our own neighborhoods, our backyards, where hunger for food and for justice are so present. Everywhere, your people resist the conquest of their lands, the conquest of their bodies, the conquest of their very existence. From centuries ago to this present moment, your people continue to cry out for peace, for justice, for the end of empire, the undoing of conquest. May we hear their voices. May we center their voices. May we echo their voices, be moved by their voices, and sing in harmony with their voices. And may our voices together, our resistance together, our unity together, our solidarity be a vision and a light and a pathway forward towards the world we must become, the world you want us to become. In the name of all that is good and righteous, we pray. Amen. So today, we are very honored by the presence of one particular voice who will share with us today her vision and her resistance, her ministry. We welcome Madison McKinney. Madison is a member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Dakota Oyate and a proud descendant from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. She currently works as the American Indian Educational Specialist in the Minneapolis area. And she also serves as a member of the Advocacy Committee on Women and Gender Justice for the Presbyterian Church USA. So today, Madison will share her personal experiences as an Indigenous person and a member of the PCUSA. Her insights and reflections will highlight the importance of revitalizing Indigenous languages in particular. I've heard Madison speak on this before, so I don't want to spoil it for you. I will only say I've learned so much from Madison, and I'm thrilled she is part of our church and willing to share with us today. So thank you so much, Madison.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Jed and Eileen, for asking me to come. I'm so honored to be here with you all. I'm going to share my screen here. And there we go. All righty. Ohan mitakiapi. Um, Dayawa chiang kapi e. We chakpi wa ko wina makiapi. Ga washichu ia Madison McKinney amakiab. Um, Hello, my relatives. It is so good to see you all today. I'm so honored to be here with you, and I'm excited to just be in this space with you all and to learn more about the work that you're doing. Um, I, as Jed mentioned, I have been involved in the Presbyterian Church my entire life. My parents are both Presbyterian ministers. They met at Dubuque Seminary, so I've been in the Peace USA world for as long as I can remember. Um, but my day job, in kind of the career path that I've taken has been through education. And so for the past year and a half, I've been working out here in the Twin Cities. I've been working in the American Indian Education Program. And so here in the state of Minnesota, they have really prioritized American Indian education through the state's education department. And so I've had the opportunity to learn a lot about my own cultural teachings, but also how can we incorporate that into the work that we're doing today? How can we kind of incorporate our traditional teachings with modern context into current systems that we have today? And so a lot of that knowledge and expertise is going to come into our work here today, including using our medicine wheel as our framework. So the medicine wheel is a historical sacred symbol used by many indigenous nations, and it can represent a lot of different things. Most often we see it representing the four seasons or the four directions, but really what it represents is our balance of well-being. And so recognizing that our physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional well-being requires balance. It also reminds us that we have balance in our elements between water, air, fire, and earth. But it can also be used as a learning tool. And so it also helps us remember that we're constantly in learning cycles. We're constantly kind of going through these seasons of life. And so this way of learning, this framework suggests that as we learn things, both on an individual level, but also as a collective, we go through these four stages, beginning with belonging, going into mastery, independence, and then reaching that phase of generosity. And so we're going to really bring this to life and kind of see in real time what this looked like, what it looks like currently, and kind of some struggles that exist exist for Indigenous people currently, but how can we bring in that historical healing in areas that have historically been filled with a lot of pain and trauma. So we're going to kind of use this as our framework for our time together today. But it's important to remember we use it kind of like a star. We visualize it as a star because it's not a linear cycle. It is something that we navigate, and through these struggles and through these adversities, it kind of impacts how well we move through them. So we're first going to take a look at our sense of belonging for Indigenous people, and particularly for Dakota people. Our sense of belonging has always been rooted in our connection to land. And so even here in the state of Minnesota, the name comes from the Dakota words Mini Sota Makoche, which talks about how the water reflects the skies. And so it is a way for us to understand our relationship from the water to the skies. The Dakota people are very in tune with our star knowledge and our relationship with our the spiritual world. And so these all played a part in who we are and our sense of belonging of where we're at, but also who we are. And so, along with that, all of these teachings have come through the form of our language. So, our Dakota language, our land, and our ways of life have always been deeply, deeply interconnected. But here in the state of Minnesota, you see this is our new state seal. All of the yellow marks represent not just the counties in the state, but also the 11 tribal nations. We see the wild rice represented here, which is indigenous to the land of Minnesota. We see Minnesota Makoche. Again, the state is really beginning to recognize the importance of honoring and valuing the indigenous perspective, the indigenous experience on our land here. And so, as we begin to talk about the history of our people and our relationship to the land and to the language, it's important to note that this is something that we've known for a very long time. And in fact, even non-Indigenous people have known for a very long time. And this was a way for us to kind of has put our people in a vulnerable position. If they could attack our land, if they could attack our language, it could attack our way of life, and it could attack our existence here. And so this has been part of our history. And so in current context, a lot of Indigenous nations are really trying to revitalize our Indigenous languages. During COVID-19, one of the silver linings of the pandemic was that it brought about online language courses. And so during COVID-19, during the pandemic, it was really critical that Indigenous nations preserve the language. And so we saw this movement of Indigenous nations focusing efforts on how do we give the language back to our people, because this is the tools that we need to have healthy lives, not just again, it gives us instructions for how we live, our ways of life, but also our relationship to the land. And so in this process of talking about how we learned, right? A historical way was to utilize our land, our relationship with the land. We learned from the plants, we learned from the animals. So this quote comes from the book of Indian Boyhood, written by Ohiesa, and it says, "We were not only good mimics, but we were close students of nature. We studied the habits of animals, just as you study your books. We watched the men of our people and represented them in our play and learned to emulate them in our lives." So Ohiesa, if you don't know the history of him, he was born here in Minnesota just shortly before 1860. And so during the 1862 Dakota Uprising, his family was actually forced to flee out to Canada. And so he was born, his first name that he was known as was Hakata. But he was part of the time period where Dakota people were being exiled out of Minnesota. And so his family fled to Canada, where he grew up off of the land. He grew up in his Dakota way of life. By the time he was a teenager, he was known as Ohiesa. But around the time that he was about 14 years old, that was around the time that we saw the rise of the boarding school era. And so his family was actually some of the founders of the Flandreau Indian boarding school, and part of the Presbyterian community in Flandreau, South Dakota, which happens to be my hometown. But what we saw was as his father actually brought him back to the United States, brought him back, took him to boarding school, where he then began his life as Charles Eastman. He would continue on and go into medical school. He would become the first Native American doctor, physician in the United States. But in his book, Indian Boyhood, he talks about how critical his early childhood training was to his ability to excel in the white man's world. So by the time he went to education, by the time he was in boarding school, a lot of what he learned as a Dakota child came in handy and helped him succeed in those other areas. So we know that as boarding schools began to rise, we began to continue to see that loss of language, that disconnection to our land. And so as we look now, we see the impact that it's having today. Give me one second here. The impact that it had was on our education system. So not only did it take away our ability to learn in our own ways, but it also imposed a new way of learning onto us. So we were now pushed into boarding schools. We were learning a new language. We were disconnected from the things that made us who we are, our entire sense of belonging. And in the meantime, we're seeing the simultaneous attempt of erasure of our history, of our stories, of our perspective. And so in the early 20th century, around 1906, we see the creation of the first national monument, which is the Devil's Tower. For Indigenous people, it is not known as Devil's Tower. For the Dakota, the Lakota, and the Nakota, we know it as Matotipila. But this is a sacred site for many Indigenous nations, the Cheyenne, Arapaho. Many Indigenous nations have their own stories connected to this sacred site. But around this time, when our people are in boarding schools and we're, really kind of under the influence of the federal government, this is when we see history beginning to be rewritten. And so due to a mistranslation at this time, Matotipila was translated into Bad God's Tower, which eventually became Devil's Tower. And so this really had an impact on our spirituality. Not only were we removed from our lands and we were being changed, forced to learn a new language, learn to learn in new ways, but we also were now being viewed, our ways of knowing our spirituality, our deep connection to land and to our God was under attack, right? And it's being painted as this sort of devil's work, right? And so at this time, it was not legal for Indigenous people to practice their own ways of spirituality. It wasn't safe. And so that's where we really began to see that breakdown of our connection to God, to earth, to our language. And we begin to see Indigenous people start to choose Christianity. They start to assimilate into this new way of living, which is where we've been for a very long time. And it hasn't been until just within the past decade or so that we've begun to see this push towards reclaiming our Indigenous sites and the names that we have known them to be. So an example of this would be Lake Calhoun in Minneapolis. Just recently, back in 2018, it was a very long battle, but in 2018, it officially was renamed to Bede-Makaska, which is the Dakota name for this lake, for this body of water. It's been a critical piece to our history, but we're beginning to see that it's important that we are being mindful of the places of the names, that we're mindful of mascots, that we're mindful of different things that have just kind of been part of our history, but we've never really begun to dig deeper into the impact that it had on Indigenous peoples. And so another example of this is actually here in my school district. I think when I gave this talk back at the end of last year, we were still in the process of discussing if this school site needed to be changed, if the name needed to be changed. Gideon Pond was a Presbyterian minister who played a critical part in the creation um, of Dakota translations. He was the Dakota Odowan that you see on the slides here. That was a piece that really, in a lot of ways, saved the Dakota language. Gideon Pond was part of the push towards translating and writing down the language, which hadn't been done before. And so it's this really tricky balance of, yes, there have been good things that have come from this individual and their life work, but we also know through his personal accounts the real reason why he was trying to translate the Dakota language, and that the intention behind his work might not have been in the best of favor for Indigenous people. And so we're beginning to really uncover that and to question, what was the purpose of it? What was the intention? And how do we balance out and recognizing the Indigenous perspective and the historical healing that our Indigenous people are needing from these stories? And so our district actually, we did propose to change the name of this particular elementary school along with 2 other sites. And when we took it to the school board actually on their own decided that they wanted to shift their policy to no longer have any names named after people, because they recognize that there is a long history to many of these historical figures that may not be reflective of the history and the perspective of the Indigenous, of our Black, Indigenous people of color and their communities and their experiences. And so this is really a step when we talk about what can we do now, right? What do we do today? We may not have been part of that historical harm, but we can be part of that historical healing. And this is just one of those ways, is continuing to support those efforts, continuing to amplify the Indigenous voices and perspectives when it comes to the names of places, when it comes to reclaiming lands, rights to the land. These are all ways that we can continue to support that shift. And we do all of this to really hit that last piece of generosity. For the Dakota people, generosity is one of our 7 virtues of our ways of life. I know generosity is also one of the 7 grandfather teachings for the Anishinaabe people or the Ojibwe people. And the purpose of this is to give back. The purpose is to recognize that we are in relationship with not just ourselves, but each other and the land, which means that when we take things or when we're gifted things, we must always give back. Right? This is a reciprocal relationship in which we're not just taking and using for our own good, but it's something that we're actively gifting back. We're actively giving back to our land. And so this quote comes from Braiding Sweetgrass. Plants know how to make medicine with light and water, and then they give it away. And I think Braiding Sweetgrass is a perfect example of what our vision is for what it looks like when we reach that historical healing. So when we can successfully take our Indigenous wisdom with our scientific knowledge, and we can integrate that into teachings that we can utilize in our everyday life, that really is the vision of Indigenous people. When we talk about the healing that we're striving to reach, we're talking about how do we successfully integrate this historical Indigenous wisdom that has been part of not just our experience, but the land for centuries, and how do we incorporate that with things that we're learning in modern contexts through Western science, through the teachings of the land, right? So we're really trying to incorporate all of these things. And again, we see this in the example of talking about bringing our language back to life, not just as a way to feel like we have a sense of belonging, but as an actual act of healing, as an actual act of medicine. Our language, water, all of these things are critical to our well-being. And we see that more than just at superficial level, right? And so when we're talking about Indigenous people in the work, how do we incorporate these perspectives? That's why we do land acknowledgements. It's more than just to give ourselves a pat on the back to say we're recognizing the land we're standing on, but it is an active reminder to our call to action that we have to actively engage Indigenous voices, Indigenous perspectives. It takes time. We have to build those relationships with our Indigenous communities. It takes trust, right? We have to have relationships with these people. We have to build that trust to really be able to gather their experience, their perspective, their knowledge, their wisdom into our current work. But as we look to do that work that God is calling us to do, as we look to for climate justice, our Indigenous voices, our Indigenous languages have all of that built into it. It is a has immense amounts of knowledge built into it, woven into it. And it's just going to take a bit of work for us to answer that call. It's going to be some deep spiritual work to recognize the role that we as Presbyterians had in this history, in the breakdown of it, but to also recognize that we could have the power to once again have an influence on Indigenous lives. The About 10 years before the federal government took over boarding schools, Christian missionaries were the ones that were creating and operating these boarding schools. It was something that they did. And so if we could have that kind of power and influence at that point, what kind of power and influence can we have today? How can we begin to shift back towards recognizing Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous wisdom, ways of knowings? But furthermore, um, maybe did we also miss an opportunity? As Presbyterians, when we first began encountering Indigenous people, did we miss an opportunity to learn how to strengthen our own connection to God and our own relationship? Had we come into Indigenous communities with a sense of curiosity rather than this sense of control? Could we have learned something differently? Could we have gained a different perspective that allowed us to reconnect to our God in our own way, in a stronger way? And that's kind of something that I, as a Presbyterian and as a Dakota woman, kind of strive for answers in life. Is how do these things balance? How do I maintain both? And so all of that to say, even just having this conversation is a privilege for me to have, because so many Indigenous people in our communities are not empowered to have this conversation yet. We have been taught that they need to be separate, that they cannot merge and they cannot go together. You have to either be traditional and choose your Dakota way of life, or you must be Christian and you must choose this Christian way of life. But again, as we're beginning to enter into this new vision of how can we be both, it's really important that the church and we as Christians do our part in being open to Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous wisdom, Indigenous ways of being, our spirituality, in a way that isn't impacted by the colonial and historical context in which we have historically had. So thank you all so much for listening. I do apologize. I'm a little flustered. It's we just hit the end of our school year, and so I'm still kind of feeling the chaos in my brain. But I do want to open it up for questions, for clarifications. If there have been parts that maybe I could be more clear or give more context in, I am more than happy to do so. But I will stop sharing here.
So I would just say that if that's you in a state of confusion, I'd be pretty amazed to see you when you're at your best, because I think you did a great job. I think that this was super helpful as we knew that it would be. I think that you brought a lot of really rich things for us to contemplate that are super helpful, especially um, that that perspective of trying to open up to indigenous wisdom and indigenous spiritualities and how can, because so much of Christianity sometimes can be very removed from the earth and us being a part of nature and a part of creation, like sometimes um, that's not as prevalent in um, what we're hearing at church sometimes. So anyway, so thank you so much. Yes, please ask your questions, make your comments. Um, we've got plenty of time.
I just
So
wanted to say thank you, Madison. And the book you recommended, Braiding Sweetgrass, is actually going to be a book study for us in August and September at our church. And it was highly recommended by my associate pastor. So it was kind of, wow, I already know about that book. But you're doing great work, and I love your enthusiasm, and you have a wonderful, wonderful smile.
Thank you so much. I sure appreciate that. And yes, I think that's a great book to study. Again, I think it really inspired so many Indigenous people to be able to incorporate both of their worlds, the kind of two worlds that we walk in. But I think she really gives us insight into what does it look like to incorporate indigenous wisdom into scientific knowledge, to be able to apply that to our daily life, to have a better relationship with ourselves, each other, and the land. I'm excited for you. Meg, I see your question about recommending any other books. So I think so Indian Boyhood, which I used in the presentation as well. It's a super old book, but I think it offers again that historical context of how Indigenous people were once learning and how helpful and incredible it was. And it gives us insights into questions that we could give today, like how do we get back to that? How do we incorporate that way of learning into modern context, even in our educational systems? So I definitely recommend anything by Charles Eastman. Again, just his life perspective and reading his writings really gives you perspective into what it's like to be both Dakota, but also to be in a non-Indigenous world as well. They're two vastly different experiences, and so anytime you can get perspective into Dakota thought and into Dakota worldview, I'll always recommend. I'm trying to think of another one. I think also too another one, it's more of like a learning book, but it's called Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Too Afraid to Ask. It's a super long title. It's written by Anton Truer, and it's less of a novel and more so of like a learning book, right? It takes you through little glimpses, but it has all the questions that you might want to ask an Indigenous person, but again, you might be too afraid to ask. It's a really good learning tool. So even if you're just looking for more context in terms of historical key points in historical history, or sorry, in Indigenous history. That's a really good read. And I'm trying to think of another one that we've I think I'll leave it at that for now. I think those are some really good ones. Again, the questions, if you're looking for anything in particular though, like if you're looking for a specific kind of genre, I'm trying to think of some more that we've been using. I feel like we've used a lot of books in our program to help us learn, and now I'm like blanking on all of them. But yeah, I definitely recommend anything by Anton Truer, anything by Charles Eastman. Those are really good books. And then of course Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is the author of Braiding Sweetgrass. I think she has another one. If it's not already published, she has another one coming out soon. So
Me. And
I
thank
was
you so
just going to
much.
say in our
Oh,
follow, sorry, in our follow-up email, we'll include some of these resources. But I think I don't know if it was Mary that was speaking or was someone else trying to speak.
me, thank you, Eileen. Yes,
Oh, Nettie.
oh, and Madison, thank you so much. I love, and I wrote it down here when you said that language supports our way of staying in relationship with the land. That's so beautifully said and so right. It feels so true. And how our sense of belonging is rooted in connection to the land. I'm an immigrant to the U.S. I'm from Venezuela, and it is. I love this place. I live in Florida, in Tampa, and we struggle with a lot of environmental issues here. Uh, and as we fight to protect very vulnerable ecosystems. Um, and it's so true. I want to belong to this place, even though I was born somewhere else. So anyway, uh, language, back to language. I When we have a president that says that English is the language of the land, even though we have so many other languages in this country, I wonder about how to resist besides just continuing to speak our languages. If there are any other strategies that you can think of, um, because of this same issue. If the land depends on us feeling that we belong to the land, and language is one way that we connect to the land, we need our languages to stay connected and to protect and to love this land, regardless of where we were born. So it should be of the interest of this nation that we can speak our different languages, and that languages will be welcome for the good of this land. So anyway, that's just what's vibrating here and resonating for me from hearing you. So thank you so much.
yes, thank you so much for sharing. I think it's times like that where any little bit of resistance makes a difference. So I'll give you the example here in my work. Every email that I send, I begin with "Oham mitakiapi." So rather than saying like "Hello, so and so" or "Hi, team," it's always addressing them as a relative. I've begun to learn how to address people in Ojibwe. Although I'm not Ojibwe, the Ojibwe language is deeply connected to this land as well. And so learning how to say "Buju" in indigenous Namadadok, right? It's a struggle, right? But being able to just do the little bit of learning how to say hello or an acknowledgement in that language can go a long way, right? Because all it takes is for one person to ask a question of, what does that mean? And it can spark curiosity for more people to learn, right? And so even if all you know is how to say hello in that language, you're still maintaining the importance of it. You're still recognizing other Indigenous people when we acknowledge their language. Another way too is just to always ensure that Indigenous language and perspective is present, right? So often we're making decisions in rooms and there's not an Indigenous person present, right? And so anytime, even if it's, pushing your legislator to specifically look at American Indian education or actively push towards specific funding towards language revitalization, right? Even again, the state seal, them recognizing the Indigenous nations in Minnesota makes such a difference, right? Recognizing them as sovereign nations might seem small to some people, but for the Indigenous people to have that recognition is so critical and important, and in reminding people that we're here. Oftentimes, just awareness that we're present, that we're still here. You'd be amazed at how many people currently today are surprised to learn that Native people are still around and that we're still existing and here. And so even when you think, oh, well, everyone should know this, ensuring that it's spoken about and at the forefront, land acknowledgements, recognizing those tribal nations, just all of those little things really go a long way. So I would encourage you to continue those efforts that are happening. And I think Mary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Madison, Barry, my husband, is on this call too. We spent 34 years in North Dakota and South Dakota. And so that was, when you move to Indian country, you really get to learn a lot about, well, you just get to learn a lot. We now live in the Bay Area in California, and it is very common practice to have a land acknowledgement before a concert, before a play, and in churches. And one of the things that Barry and I get frustrated about is that that's where it stops. There's no attempt to learn about the history of the peoples in your area, connect with that group, go visit the Indian Health Center in San Jose and find out what issues are here. And what ideas do you have for churches to move beyond a land acknowledgement?
Yes. Yes, that is such a great point. And it's hard because I think one of the things that stops people from doing more than that is fear of being wrong or fear of saying the wrong thing, right? But really, when we begin to just fight through that fear, we begin to reach out to Indigenous communities, right? No matter where you go, there should be an Indigenous nation, an Indigenous organization, or an Indigenous community that is formulated, right? And so building those relationships, consulting people to come out to your church. One of the things that I have found to be really helpful has been we consulted an kind of ethnobotanist to come out and took us out to a field just down the street from our high school. And she was able to show us different plant medicines and food that were right beneath our feet. And so she taught us, these things that we call weeds that a lot of people are, actively trying to keep out of their lawns. This is actually a really valuable first aid medication, right? And so being able to learn about the actual lands that we are a part of, that we're stepping on every single day, really helps you build that relationship with the land, right? So finding Indigenous leaders who can do that, it doesn't have to just be about the land, right? Anytime an Indigenous person is actively incorporating their Indigenous wisdom with their, scientific work, it's going to be helpful in getting modern context in how you can support that local tribal nation or those local indigenous efforts that are happening in your area. But yeah, I would definitely start by learning about the land, beginning to ask questions. If you don't even know where to start, like what tribal nations might be in your area or what organizations, begin by asking questions, right? Ask the question of where was this land, who occupied this space first? What's the historical context behind the name of the city or a lake or a river that's nearby? So using your landmarks and questioning kind of the names or how they were created or the historical context of them can help you uncover those indigenous stories and perspectives that maybe aren't well known or broadly talked about. And then Brian, yep.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Madison, for your testimony to this morning. I'm calling you from the Bay Area, what is called Silicon Valley, Muwekma, Ohlone territory. My mother's native from Peru. Some of you already know that on this call, but Madison does not. First generation California. My father was English Canadian, so I share the similar struggle to you because of our faith in being Christian, yet our way of life, if you will, is very indigenous and seeking to understand that. My challenge is to the Presbyterian church, because I don't attend the Presbyterian church unless it's occasion for my mother, but I do have a congregation membership, if you will, elsewhere. But anyway, I'd like to encourage a people acknowledgement, and as you say, have the people present who have that voice from the textbooks, from the books, and I appreciate Presbyterians for wanting to study and read, but my goodness, we have our original guide for life. It's called the Bible, regardless of its edits and deletions or whatever it may be to fit certain agendas through over time. But we have an incredible resource with the neighbors, and that's something I've been encouraging all along in my presence and when the spaces I go into. It's like we can offer a testimony. I'm not going to deny who my father was or my mother because they happen to be really good people and they actually worked their relationship the best they could. And that's my testimony. And I was raised in a pretty good way, but I make Lakota my tradition way of life. So I feel like you're a relative in a way, because my understanding there's 3 bands and whatnot. Because I needed to go through my decolonization. I'm very blessed that came to me at 20 years old, invited to my first Inipi. And I saw people participating, and they happened to be all good men. And that was my consternation with going to Catholic Mass. I wanted to be the helper. I wanted to be the altar boy. I guess I didn't know that we even the terms at 5 years old. But I saw people participating in the prayer service and talking and getting something together. And that's what drew me to the congregation. Go now because we have an outdoor service once a year, or they did at a park. And I said, wow, if my tribal family's doing something at a park, I could do something with this group of people too. And they're going through their changes too, with a number of other reasons. But I would also believe back into my mother's concept and mine too, is just reach into economically. If you're going to buy local, buy local. Minnesota has the maple syrup, use that into your products, everyday use. And yes, money is necessary because we all have bills. My commodity happens to be coffee. Some of the people know that on the call. It's coming from Peru, the families I know. And that's my testimony because I really don't like the piece of paper and I try not to do even contracts if necessary. But when it is, you have to get the permits and licenses and whatever. And people are making money on that. And this is why things tend to be more expensive. But yeah, fantastic work. Maybe somehow we'll be in contact with each other. And what I'm missing I'll just be brief, is just a peer group. People kind of closer to my age, because even with the thoughts I have, of course, Christianity comes into play and there's a lot of pushback. And but I've been present for a while now. And it comes from both communities. So family, it's another pretty good. But thank you. I'm flustered too. I feel this energy level. and I don't drink my coffee every day. I have Holy Spirit to give me this encouragement. So as
Thank
your
you.
teacher, you're doing it. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah.
Yeah. Me
Yep.
taco así. We're all related.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Bastante.
Okay.
We might have time for maybe one more question, and then I want to give a quick Oak Flat update. Does anybody else have a
I have a
Jed?
question, but I'm afraid it's going to open up a whole new can of worms. But I'll ask it anyways. First of all, I want to say thank you for your presentation. Thank you also for uh, from a this is a very Western kind of take for giving us some best practices on how to kind of engage Indigenous communities in our own backyards. That's always been a hope of mine for the church at large. You know, to this group, but for others. I mean, how do we start those relationships? Because I think that's very daunting. But apart from that, I just wanted to ask you, you have shared with, you know, kind of I guess, your own kind of journey, and we just heard from Brian now as well. And you mentioned both your parents were pastors in the Presbyterian Church, and there's kind of a whole voice in the Presbyterian Church that I think many of us don't know even exists really, which is all the Native American congregations. And I'm wondering, what is the tension, if there are, or what is happening in those spaces, and what can those of us who are not Native American or don't identify within the Presbyterian Church, how can we support what's happening in the among Native American congregations?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really tricky. I'll say that. Again, I think again, we've been legally able to practice our Indigenous spirituality, our faith as Indigenous people, but because of this long colonial impact on that spirituality, it has led to a huge divide. Again, between you either chose to truly hang on to your traditional way of life, or you completely chose Christianity. And so when we saw the rise of boarding schools, we saw that split where if you chose Christianity, you were choosing not just Christianity, but you were choosing to give up your traditional way of life. You're choosing to give up your language, your practices. And so out of survival, for generations, we saw our families and our people beginning to choose Christianity. And so that's kind of what's led to this breakdown of our languages, of our culture, of our communities, has been because of this spiritual divide of you're either going to choose Christianity or you're going to choose your traditional way of life. And so when we talk about it now, again, many people are still very much deeply rooted in that belief. So even if I go back home to Dakota Presbytery, even within Indigenous communities, we're still in this struggle between, do we incorporate part of our cultural practices into this area or not? And right now we're still in this place of no, where it's very much common for Indigenous communities to not intermix the two. However, in other spaces, we are learning that we can't do that. And if we continue to do that, our languages might not survive, our culture, our ways of life, like they might not continue on. And so we have to find a way to incorporate them. And so what people can do now is, again, begin to kind of question your history, your church's history, the history in your local setting, of different place names, because a lot of those things stemmed from conflict or a difference of perspective with Indigenous communities. And so as you begin to do that digging, you're going to come up with questions, and it might lead you to the right points of contact in your area, right? Um, the it, it another again, as we question those things, it then allows us to question the colonial context. So again, going back to that Matotipila and Devil's Tower, if we start to question, well, why is it named Devil's Tower? That's when we learn, oh, it stemmed from this mistranslation from the indigenous people. Well, how do we now begin to bring that perspective back into the conversation? And how do we engage people who do have that historical knowledge into conversation? So I hope that kind of makes sense. So as we begin to kind of question, it will lead to the right answers that will help you find the right people or the right organizations that are also advocating for these efforts and these shifts to be made. I hope does that answer your question, Jen? Okay.
So I
And
know I said one more, but I'll let Barry say whatever he wants to say.
Well, I posted a comment, Madison, saying that Mary and I, having lived in North and South Dakota for 34 years, admire any Indigenous person who grew up in South Dakota and can still smile. So thank you for that. One of the things I wondered is whether we as Presbyterians could make some contacts and maybe learn something from the Episcopalians, who were also obviously part of the boarding school problem, but produced Vine Deloria, who was a great scholar, Indian scholar. And also, while we were in South Dakota, had a bishop who was Lakota, Creighton Robertson, who I know developed some liturgy that drew upon Lakota culture. So maybe the Episcopalians, I know that's controversial, but maybe the Episcopalians would have something to offer here that we could learn from.
yes, that's a great point. And an excellent, yes. The Episcopalians do have a long history in many Indigenous communities. And I think anytime that we can see what's working in other places and can try to utilize that in our own spaces as well, that is definitely a critical piece in this process for sure. Yep.
And then Eileen, I just wanted people to know that I posted some good news about the land that the Amah here are trying to protect from a quarry. And our church has been involved in supporting them in that area. And there's a story a week ago that another environmental group has bought another large portion of the land that's at issue. And it seems that the developer may be giving up on the project. That's not final yet, but it seems to be good news.
Great. It's always great to hear good news. Thanks for that, Barry. Just want to say thanks again, Madison, for joining us today. This has been a great and rich conversation. I'm sure everyone agrees. And I'm definitely going to have to go back and look at this transcript and rewatch and take notes and hopefully make a blog post about this because I think this was just a really rich conversation with lots of learnings for all of us. So thank you. And I just want to give a quick update on Oak Flat. I think most of you have probably seen my updates by email that the Supreme Court unfortunately decided not to take up their case. Two justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, they were they wanted to hear the case, but we needed two more justices to vote to hear the case and did not meet that threshold. So they filed another injunction, I think I understand it, in the district court in Phoenix and were denied that, but the judge did give them some kind of a ruling where when the environmental impact study comes out on June 16th, that the land swap won't be able to happen immediately. There will be 60 days before the land swap happens. So I'm hoping that's going to give an opening for more filings based off of what is in the environmental impact study, because the legislation was written in such a way that it didn't matter that the environmental impact study could say that the environment is going to be destroyed. There's going to be no water for areas or contaminated water. So I'm hoping once people can see the reality, hopefully there'll be some other forms that they're legal. They'll have more opportunities, I hope. But anyway, so keep them in your prayers, and I'm going to send an email with their asking for folks to send letters to President Trump, but also to send letters to members of Congress, even members that aren't your members. So I will send more information on those advocacy asks by email. So thanks again, and
Eileen, just could
yes,
you also send out that dissent that Justice Gorsuch wrote?
yes, yes, yeah. I'm
Because
very, I will
it's a
share
very
that.
good discussion of religious
Mhm.
freedom
Yes, thank,
and and indigenous people.
yeah, thanks, Barry. I will share that with everyone. And thanks for sharing that with me by email. So, thanks again, Madison, and I hope you have a great rest of your week, everyone. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bendiciones.